अब मैं नुसरत ख्वाजा को बुलाऊँगी। नुसरत से मैंने बात शुरू की थी कि हम किस चीज़ पे बात करेंगे या कौन से ऐसे आर्टिस्ट हैं जिनको वो उन पे बात करेंगी। तो सिंध से हमारे पास आर्टिस्ट हैं मुसर्रत मिर्ज़ा, जिन पे नुसरत हमें एक प्रेजेंटेशन देंगी और उनके काम पे बात करेंगी, क्योंकि नुसरत ने उनके काम को बहुत स्टडी किया है। और नुसरत का अपना एक मैं इंट्रोडक्शन दे दूं कि नुसरत एज एन इंडिपेंडेंट रिसर्चर, क्यूरेटर एंड freelance writer on art and literature. She is also a practicing landscape artist. Nusrat has a major in cultural anthropology from Mount Holyoke College, USA. She is a participant of discursive committee of Karachi Biennale. So Nusrat, please. हबीबुल्ला साहब जो हैं वो हमारे यहाँ कल्चर डिपार्टमेंट में डायरेक्टर परफॉर्मिंग आर्ट्स हैं। सो हबीबुल्ला साहब आप आएँ और
Assalamu alaikum. My thanks to the Sindh Culture Department and to Wahida Baloch for inviting me to speak to all of you today. My talk is on Nusrat Mirza and her relationship with a growing spiritualism. It's called Infinite Journey, A Quiet Revolution in the Art of Nusrat Mirza. You can see her painting is just gorgeous. Nusrat Mirza's paintings are impregnated with mood and atmosphere. The dust, the haze, the shadows and empty spaces of the desert town Sakhar become signifiers of a deep reflection on the meaning of existence. She has said many times that she is a traveler on a journey. In this talk, I would like to follow her journey as expressed in the evolution of her art, to try and interpret the path she is traveling as an artist, as well as a spiritual seeker, to try and follow the journey which she describes as La Mehdood, infinite or limitless. Nusrat Mirza was born in Sakhar in 1939. The town was and remains the center of her universe. This was the terrain that nurtured her beginnings as an artist. Nusrat was a sensitive and observant child. The exhilaration of nature, of sunlight glinting on ripples of water, the joy in the smells and sounds of rainfall had always appealed to her sensitive nature. Her father brought her crayons and paper when she was very young, and she reveled in the play of line and color. Now, Nusrat has been described as a landscape painter, and this may have been true in the early part of her life. But her art goes far beyond the descriptive character of landscape art. As a student in Lahore in the 1960s, she painted figuratively, and she created landscapes as well. When she returned to Sakhar after studying in the Punjab for 6 years, she found herself immersed in the solitude of her home. The community that had nourished her training as an artist was left behind in Lahore. Somewhat isolated back in Sakhar, and before moving to Jamshoro, where she taught for 30 years, she looked around her home for sights of interest. She painted women moving through narrow alleys, children playing games, Alghoza playing musicians, and we've had a brilliant performance earlier. She painted shrines, donkeys, flocks of pigeons. They were all part of her repertoire. There was innocence in her work, but there was also distress. She painted the anguish on the faces of parents whose child had been kidnapped. Many of these early paintings are now lost or damaged or out of the country. And we don't have the privilege of seeing examples of them. But in time, the joyous and sad narratives of human experience would give way to a preference for architectural forms. From the elevated viewpoint of a rooftop, she observed the architecture of cube-shaped houses and the play of light and shadow on their angular surfaces. She is an excellent draftsperson, but she lets go of sharp lines and delineates changes of angle with touches of light. We can see how she uses it to highlight each step, just a sliver of light. The relationship of light and shadow becomes central to her mid-career shift in style. In Nusrat's paintings, light enters through slats and apertures. The angles with which it falls and bends create their own geometrical forms. These transient angles are determined by the position of the sun at specific times of the day. Nusrat's careful observation of time and space enables her to capture the moment when the shafts yield strong compositional possibilities. We can say that she is observing the sensory world, but from the perception of the sensory world, her attention is turned to a metaphysical dimension, which concerns a deeply spiritual inquiry into the mystery of divinity. Her inquiry is reflected in changes in her art. From an impressionistic rendering of open composition, strong line work, and changing quality of light and right-angle geometry, her style incorporates greater abstraction and expressionist strokes of the brush. The stylistic shift is highly significant because it marks a journey of spiritual and philosophical reflection. She retains the language of architecture, and she uses it as a scaffolding to express the presence of an invisible dimension. Figures start to dissolve as abstraction features more strongly. The human presence, which has been depicted as a subtle hint, you can see a girl here painted in quite an abstract style, women moving through narrow streets, or a female form seated in an impressionistic interior. These figures start to fade out entirely. Her color palette, always derived from a mixture of hues created by herself and never used directly from the tube, become more somber and diffused. And here you can barely tell if that's a figure or a shadow. You know, they're dissolving into abstraction. The shadows and melting forms seem to correspond to the Sufi concept of fana, which concerns the diminishing of ego in order to expand spiritual receptivity. In her early work, Nusrat Mirza cast her artistic eye on the visible reality of her surroundings of Sakhar. Now she overlays that with discovery of sensations she perceives with her inner eye. Her journey, which she calls La Mehdood, is to penetrate the spiritual realm. Her metaphysical world is immensely enlarged, and this is noted in her painting. The mystery she seeks is not transcendent. Of course, transcendence is something that is outside the world, but she seeks it within this world. This is quite important, I think. It permeates the air she breathes. It permeates the alleys which cast dark shadows, the interior walls of abodes which are pierced with a window through which a diffuse light enters but barely illuminates the household objects within. The spiritual dimension for Nusrat Mirza is immanent and ubiquitous. It's manifested in the material world. Here I would like to suggest that Nusrat connects immanence with the dust or mitti. Actually, mitti does not actually correspond to dust, but I'm just using it because I couldn't find a more appropriate word in English. But she associates immanence with the dust of Sindh. The pervasive quality of immanence finds correspondence with the pervasive nature of mitti. She has said that human beings have an affinity with mitti because we are made of it. The myriad particles of dust that hang heavy in the air of Sakhar become a metaphor for the immanence of divine mystery. It pervades everything, is everywhere, and yet to understand it, it requires an expansion of your own sense of perception. You need to dematerialize, so to speak, dissolve in the immanence, go beyond the preoccupations of the ego. Her painting represents a deep integration of visual perception and a growing spiritual perception. The sense of place with limits, because a place always has limits, is overtaken by a sense of space which is limitless. One can say that her work is a study, an inquiry into the way the spiritual inhabits the world we breathe, we feel joy in and pain in, and we wonder about the mysteries of the nature of being. She is painting her intuition. She explores light and dark to calibrate her understanding of the ineffable but powerful phenomenon of mystical longing. Light plays the role of a character within the composition that is signaling to her something that lies beyond visual depiction, namely the interiority of thought and philosophical reflection. Its sparing weightage against dimmer segments in the painting calls attention to the nature of reality, to our perception of truths that are partially revealed, and the vast truths that are hidden and remain to be discovered along our journey. The notion of Zahir and Batin, manifest and hidden, is infused in Musarrat's depiction of light and dark. The quest to embrace the esoteric reality of the universe is ever present. The flashes of light bear equivalence with flashes of insight in our consciousness. How does one portray what can be perceived by the mind and never in physical form? To summarize, one can say that Musarrat Mirza is painting philosophically. Her treatment of landscape is not merely about documentation. Rather, the landscape is creating an experience of place that goes beyond the tangible. Her genius as an artist lies in synthesizing the intangible with the tangible tools of the artist, the canvas, the paint, and the brush. She is creating a philosophical aesthetic which takes its idioms from the local environment. She does not embellish with the exotic or fetishize tropes that represent Sufi quest. She does not reference literary sources. Her art is personal, it's idiomatic, it is rooted in immediate surroundings and yet able to express truths that go beyond representation. This sensibility, which depicts spirituality and a deep affinity to the local environment, is uniquely Musarrat Mirza and what I see as a quiet revolution in her art. Thank you.